All right. Well, welcome everyone. I think it's a nice and small intimate group to the Accounting Design Project. Jan and Steve, thank you for inviting me to moderate the session today. My name is Jenny Chu. In case we haven't met, I'm an associate professor at the Judge Business School, University of Cambridge, as in Cambridge, England. Thank you both for putting on this series. I think the papers all have great implications for both academics and practitioners. And I really love the virtual format, which is so democratic as researchers from literally around the world can join the discussion. Before we get into Venkat's very interesting paper on estimating maintenance capex, I just wanted to quickly remind everyone of a few housekeeping terms. First, while we encourage you to keep your video on to have a more interactive workshop, unless you're asking a question, please keep your microphone on mute. Second, I will give the speaker 5 minutes in the beginning and again at the end to present without interruptions. So if you'd like to ask a question, please either raise your hand in Zoom or ask a question and type your questions in the chat box. From time to time, I will interrupt Venkat and invite you to ask a question. Please then state your name and your school before asking your question. Of course, those rules don't apply to Steve, who will be joining us late, and he can ask questions whenever he likes. So with that said, Venkat, the floor is now with you.
Thank you, Jenny. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this presentation. I really thank Ayang and Stephen for inviting me to this presentation. So before I start, I just wanted to I don't know how many of you guys were there last week in the last week's presentation. So we had Anoop and Ethan talk about an issue of capitalizing the investment portion of the expenses. Now today I'm going to talk about the expenses related to assets which are already capitalized, the long-term operating assets. Okay, so it sounds like a nice continuation of taking the journey forward. So before I start, I want to give a small caveat in the sense that the objective of this paper is not to suggest any changes in the accounting regulations, because that would take us to a whole different debate of whether the assets should be fair valued on the balance sheet or not, etc., etc. What I'm going to focus on in this presentation is to see if I can estimate something called as maintenance capex. And with that, if I can provide a more informative non-GAAP measure of earnings than the current GAAP measure of earnings. Let's see. Oh, why the slide's not moving forward? Okay. So the most commonly, as we all know, the most commonly used non-GAAP measure in the industry is Ebitda, which is basically excluding depreciation and amortization expenses, and kind of ignoring the cost of capacity incurred in generating the revenue. Okay, and they have their own reasons, saying that depreciation amortization expense is based on historical cost. It is it has the influence of managers' discretion and choosing the useful lives, etc., etc. But then the solution to that could not be like just blindly excluding the most important, one of the most important costs, right? We have the likes of Warren Buffett who keep on reiterating the importance of including capacity cost in the GAAP measure of earnings or in the measure of earnings, right? But the problem is they also acknowledge that depreciation amortization expense is not a good measure of the economic capacity cost. Okay, so we know that it's important, but we don't have a really good measure to kind of measure it, right? So Warren Buffett actually proposes another non-GAAP measure of earnings called as owner's earnings. Now this owner's earnings just excludes the D&A expense and then subtracts something called as average annual maintenance capex, right? Now this maintenance capex is defined as the per period capacity cost incurred because of the usage of long-term assets, which the company requires to maintain its current operations. But the big problem is, how do you estimate this annual maintenance capex? And without that, you cannot compute this non-GAAP measure of owner's earnings. Now, why should investors care about the maintenance capex estimate? One is that it might provide a better assessment of profitability if the investors are using the current earnings to get an estimate of the future earnings. a maintenance capex would definitely help in better projecting the profitability of the firm. The second aspect is it will enable the investors to actually separate the maintenance portion and the growth portion of a firm's investment, right? And oftentimes, like you see that, like, companies are announcing big investments, but then we do not have information as to how much of that investment is actually going to drive the future growth, right? So investors could take the whole thing as investment by capex, or they could just consider the whole thing as maintenance capex, or anywhere in between. Another important issue is there's a good paper by Jackson et al. In 2009, JEE paper. And what they find is that the firms that use accelerated depreciation, they make significantly larger capital investments and more timely investments than firms using a straight line depreciation. Now, what's the implication of this for the investors? If investors figure out that a certain firm is under depreciating regularly, that could imply that these firms are more likely to postpone their investments, right? To postpone replacing their unproductive assets. And when they finally make those investments, it could be too late, right? So these could again provide investors with the knowledge of like how much price they can pay for a dollar of investment. Finally, when the investors are forecasting free cash flows, an assessment of the maintenance capex or the future maintenance capex will give them better information on how to project future cash flows for the valuation. So all these three major areas kind of showcase the importance of an estimate of maintenance capex. But how big is this problem? So that's the next question, right? Is it really a problem to consider, or something which is very trivial and we don't have to bother about it? So I kind of looked at a lot of 10Ks to see if any firm actually discloses this maintenance capex in their footnotes or somewhere. But I could hardly find 2 or 3 firms, and those are very small firms, which actually put the maintenance capex figure in a footnote. So I had to fall back to a research report by Morgan Stanley way back in '97, which I borrowed from Trevor. What they did is they looked at each industry and some of the major companies in the industry. They did an in-depth analysis of firm-specific and industry-specific analysis and came out with a dollar amount of estimated maintenance capex. Now that's being compared to the reported depreciation cost. And what they found is the difference can cause a change in earnings to the extent of like from -7% to almost like -80%. The 80% is of WorldCom, which is an aberration. We all know what WorldCom has gone through during that time. But generally, it's about -7 to -40% for the telecom industry. Now, this industry has gone through a lot of technological changes and everything, right? But if you look at automotive industry, which was kind of a mature industry in the 90s, there also you see a significant problem. Percentage change in the income because of this is about -20% to 30%, right? So this shows that there is a significant change in the estimate of earnings because of estimating the maintenance capex. So having known the effect of that such an estimate can provide, my main objective of this paper is to kind of provide a systematic approach to computing maintenance capex that can be applied to a large sample of firms, because unlike an analyst who can focus on each firm and each industry, if you were to apply for a large sample of firms, it would become extremely difficult to do a firm-specific analysis, right? So that calls for a very parsimonious model to kind of roughly estimate a maintenance capex, which is better than the existing D&A expense, and may not be the perfect measure, but still better than the D&A expense. Now, what do I do? Once you estimate the maintenance capex, it can be used to compute 2 more measures, right? One is the under depreciation. I can compare it with the actual D&A expense and figure out how far is the estimated maintenance capex from that. The second one is I can actually compare the estimated maintenance capex with the investment. Okay, so this will tell me whether the firm is actually investing at least to the extent of maintenance capex, if not more, right? So both these measures could have different implications. One is really affecting the current earnings. The other is giving me a sense of the investment policy of the company, whether it's investing enough, or like, not enough compared to the competition, right? Now, what do I find using my estimate of maintenance capex? I find that in my sample, the firm which under
Hi,
depreciated.
Venkat. We've passed the 5 minutes mark, and Ayan raised her hand. So
Sure.
if I may, Ayan, go
If
ahead.
you want, you can finish your discussion of the findings, and then I can come back.
Yeah, I can just wrap up in a minute, and then we can.
Yeah, sure.
So using my estimate of maintenance capex, I find that a median firm under depreciates to the extent of 25% compared to the actual D&A expense recorded. And it also overstates the operating earnings by 7%. And then I use the measure of under depreciation to show that it's positively associated with future write-offs, which means that if the level of under depreciation is higher, which means your depreciation and amortization expense is lower than what it should have been. So you expect more write-offs in the future. And that would lead to a negative association with the future earnings. Now, high level of under depreciation predicts negative future abnormal returns. Just to show whether this information of estimated maintenance capex is already priced, or are the investors surprised, negatively surprised in the future. And the zero investment portfolio that goes long on the high decile of under depreciation and short on the low decile of under depreciation generates a negative return of annualized return of 3% after controlling for the 5 factors. The next construct, I'll just finish this one. The next construct is the under investment and the implications of it. Now I use this investment actually to look at a bigger question of the relationship between investment and future stock returns. There's a big literature on this question, and it's been established that there's a negative relationship between investment and stock returns. Now, there are so many explanations provided for it, the major ones being the behavioral explanation, saying that investors go for empire building, so these investments do not actually result in future earnings, growth in future earnings. And there's a risk-based explanation which says that taking up an investment is like realizing the option. And once you realize the option, the risk premium required is lower. But I kind of provide an alternate explanation that it could just be the negative relationship could just be because investors overreact to the current period investments because they cannot distinguish between the maintenance component and the growth component. So accordingly, I find that for a given level of current investments, firms whose estimated maintenance capex is higher tend to experience more negative future returns than other firms. So what I find is the level of under investment in the current year is positively associated with future investments and also positively associated with abnormal investments. This is to show that compared to my maintenance capex measure, if the firm is investing less in the current year, it'll obviously have to catch up in the future, right? So they tend to make more investments in the future and abnormal investments too. And also the negative relationship between the investment and future stock returns is found to be more pronounced for firms with higher level of estimated maintenance capex. Yes, Ayang, we can talk.
So do you mind roll back to the 1997 and 1996 kind of like anecdotal cases?
This one?
Yeah, so I think this kind of like, I'm curious about the sources of a discrepancy. So I think when I read the paper, it seemed to kind of like talking about 2 different measurement issues. One is based on the historical purchase price of the assets, there are different allocation schedules. One is straight line, only estimating the expected useful life. The other one seems to kind of match depreciation amortization with the realized actual usage, or try to match with revenue, using revenue as a proxy for some sort of the usage mapping. So that is one kind of like measurement regime. But the other one, when you talk about absolute technological absolute, it kept thinking about, oh, the fair value, the market value of those assets actually drops during the expected useful life. But like the fair value or market value is something about what's the expected future usage, right, by a collective group of firms or market participants. So I just want to understand that for here, the difference between the reported depreciation versus the estimated maintenance, the difference is mainly driven by because those firms use a straight line rather than matching with realized usage or revenue, or it's because there's a changes in expectation about future usage collectively?
So
which source drives is the difference?
Yeah, so with respect to these analyst reports, they do not mention the procedure they use to estimate this, but the starting point for this estimation is the Capex, right? So they look at the investment the company made in the current year, and then they're looking at like how much of this is just for maintenance, and how they do it is a black box, right? So how much of it is for maintenance, how much of it is for future growth? So that's the methodology they use for that is not evident from the report.
So that
Can I answer that? Can I answer
yeah, okay.
that?
Okay, you can answer
Seeing
that.
I was the one who did it.
Yeah.
The reality is you've made a distinction which is not there, because the question, and it relates to one of the questions on the chat, is when you think about pricing and revenue and your profit margins, your economic profit margins, what you should be reflecting is the cost being incurred, okay, to assuming you want to sustain the business. What do you have to spend in order to sustain the business? And so if you take the telecom business as an example, to the extent that there were people putting in fiber optic cables, or in that stage we were going from copper wire to DSL to etc. So there was a detailed technological analysis done to understand what these companies would have to be spending on an annualized basis in order to basically stay competitive. And so it's a combination of whatever they were doing historically and whatever they paid, and what it would take to, what they'd need to spend to do it. And to the extent that a competitor introduces new technology, you have to spend or you go out of business. And so it's the notion that Venkat's trying to find. And the beauty of this paper to some extent is the fact that he's done it systematically. We had, in the case of airlines, actually, we hired a consultant who did a 25-year analysis by plane. So you can do this at a very specific detailed analysis, but to do it at a more systematic basis using archival data is where it's particularly hard. But your distinction, it's not a fair value issue at all. It's a question of what you need to spend to sustain the business. And to the extent that might also lead to growth opportunities, it's fine, but you have to spend it, otherwise you don't survive.
Now, another thing I would like to highlight here is this particular estimation is normally in terms of the replacement cost, right? So what do you have to spend now to kind of generate the same revenue which you have generated using the old assets, right? Now, the new price or based on new technology could be high, low compared to the older assets price, historical price, right? The drawback in my study is I can only look at the historical prices and how the costs have been allocated, and not really get to what does it take in the current year to kind of generate the same sales. But so you're operating somewhere in between just the D&A expense and the actual replacement cost, which you need to kind of generate the same revenue. So my estimate would probably fall in the middle, I would say. Yeah. So the main intention is to kind of look at the rate of obsolescence in the recent past and use that as an estimate of in the future also you might face a similar rate of obsolescence, and that you need to incorporate into the cost, capacity cost. So that's what I'm focusing on.
So Venkat, at this point, I think it's a fair.
I'm sorry, is it too noisy out here? So there's some machines going on.
Oh, okay, Venkat, at this point, we can ask two related questions about differentiating maintenance capex to depreciation by Oliver and also by Adam. Oliver, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I just had a quick clarification question. First of all, nice paper, Venkat. Thanks for presenting. The slide you initially had where you compare depreciation to maintenance capex. I was just wondering whether they're really the same thing here, whether they really try to capture the same economic construct. On the one hand, you have depreciation, which seems to kind of fall into the category of, okay, we have an asset right now and we're using it up. On the other hand, maintenance capex seems to include also other things. For example, when you have certain repairs or if you have certain really one-time things. So it's not just the usage of your existing capacity, there might also be other stuff included in there. So I was just wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, so that's why I started my presentation saying that I'm not suggesting any change in accounting rules for how depreciation should be done, because the intention of that depreciation is normally to allocate historical cost over a period of time, not really to measure the economic capacity cost. But if you look at the earnings measure as an investor, I want some economic capacity cost to be recorded so that I get a good measure of earnings. Okay, so you're right. I mean, it's not a like-for-like comparison, but it's what you have right now, and this is what might be more beneficial than that. That's what my point is.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's just about saying to be a bit careful there, right? Because the maintenance costs, they will be included in the earnings measure already. They will be in SG&A or something like that. So I was just wondering about that direct comparison.
Yeah, so the maintenance cost, which I'm talking about, is more related to the capitalized long-term assets, which is also recorded in the GAAP earnings over a period of time. So you have a D&A expense on one hand, and you have write-downs and impairments which happen, every now and then. I'm trying to just put them together and give an annual measure of what that cost could be. If write-off or impairment were to happen on a regular basis every year, then we may not have that big of a problem, or my measure wouldn't add any big value. But the thing that the fact that the write-offs or impairments happen, once in a while and in a lumpy way, right? So it kind of distorts the earnings, and that's been the reason why investors kind of ignore it as a one-time cost. Because the comparability is reduced between two companies if you include that. So the convenient way is to just exclude it, ignore it.
Can I make one more observation on that, Venkat,
Sure.
which might be helpful to Oliver? Your point is well taken, Oliver, but actually with these corporate, at least the companies we looked at, the amount of repairs and maintenance as opposed to the required spending for capital expenditure was trivial. Actually, it wasn't very thing. In fact, we had one analyst in Japan who thought it was only, maintenance capex is sort of, in some sense, a misnomer, because it's not to maintain the capital equipment, it's to maintain the revenue generating ability.
Right.
And so that's why it's a little different to the concept that you were alluding to. But the point is well taken. It just wasn't material in these large corporations.
Yeah, thanks, Trevor. That's a good clarification of what the maintenance refers to. Yeah.
Adam, are you ready for your question?
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah. No, I was just making the point that that it could just be an inflation impact, and that because you paid for these things a long time ago, and it would cost more to get the same thing today. But I think that point's kind of already been alluded to or hinted at in this conversation.
And not to ignore at all Subdipta's points. You made a couple points, Subdipta. Would you like to elaborate?
So one point was just that maintenance capex seems to be really relevant for free cash flows, because that's sort of part of what we think of as free cash flows. So to the extent that analysts focus on that, that's another motivation for why this exercise is useful. And then the other point I made was that in the old days, railroad accounting and I think even telecom accounting had other methods that were more like inventory accounting. So they had methods that were analogous to FIFO and LIFO, where basically you take tracks out of service. So you retire them, you can take them out of the old cost, and then you put in sort of, the new track, and that would be the replacement cost. Yeah. So And so they had this equivalent where you could do it under FIFO, which would be a retirement method, or LIFO, which would be replacement method. And so you have a set of data out there that you can use to sort of see what your estimate is closer to. Is it closer to the retirement or replacement and so on?
Okay. So Sudipta, thank you for the suggestion, but do they provide information on the investment as well? Like, how do you figure out which investment was later or which investment was earlier?
It's all as part of inventory, right? So the railroad track,
Okay.
they're just building tracks all over the place. So you have a stock, just like you would have with inventory, right? So, except they're not selling the track, but it's an account that each layer, as you spend money on building track, you just put it into this account. And then, every now and then you have to replace it because the wood wears out,
Right.
track gets old. The same with telephone poles, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that and the wires. So they have to replace them periodically. And so they were using a sort of inventory method for depreciation instead of what we do now.
Right. Got it.
And so just an interesting data set that you might be able to exploit.
Sure. Thank you. Any further questions, Jenny?
No, I think it's best for you to move on.
Yeah. Okay. So before I go to the model which I use to estimate the maintenance capex, just a snapshot of what we have right now. So there, in the past, in 60s and 70s, this issue, was a lot of papers were there on this issue mainly because of the inflation being too high and all that. But the studies I found that they specifically concentrated on a particular asset, and they use the price data or the rental value, future rental values of these assets to kind of compute the level of depreciation or economic capacity cost. But the problem with this is, like, you can only do it for, a particular asset. I mean, we all know that a firm has a lot of assets bunched up together on the balance sheet, and such a mechanism is not very practical to do it on an asset-specific basis. For the large sample studies, we just have the reported D&A expense or the capital expenditure as alternatives to measure maintenance capex. Now, D&A expense, it's again, it's just a wear and tear cost based on historical cost pricing, and do not include any technological obsolescence, whereas capital expenditure can actually include investment for growth. So both these measures are, like, on extreme ends. So may not really represent the true economic cost of generating the current revenues. Then we have Bruce Greenwald's measure trying to compute maintenance capex. And what he suggests in his book is, you take the capex, you compute the investment capex, you subtract it, and you get the maintenance capex. But how do you measure the investment capex? They look at the average PPE to sales ratio over the last 5 years, and then multiply that with the current year growth in sales. And that they label it as investment capex. Okay. Now, the problem with this is you need a very stable company and an ideal company to kind of compute such a measure. What if the firm does not invest in capex in a particular year? How do you compute the maintenance capex for that year? The second thing is, what if there's a decline in sales in a particular year because of market downturns? Then you would end up having a very high maintenance capex value if you compute it using this method, right? So this methodology also has its limitations in terms of, how practical it is to compute for large sample firms. Now, given this background, what I try to do is, I would like to describe 4 main characteristics which I consider before modeling the maintenance capex cost. The first and primary thing is I want to include both the wear and tear cost, the physical cost, as well as the technological obsolescence cost. That's my primary motivation, right? So you have a periodic wear and tear cost, which is termed as the traditional mortality rate cost. And then you have the technological obsolescence represented by write-offs and impairments, right? So in write-offs, what do I include? I have the asset write-downs, I have losses of sale on assets, then you have goodwill impairments, and then there's this unexplained portion of special items. If it is negative, I include that into the write-offs as well. Now, the problem with this is, one could just compute this on an annual basis for a specific firm, right? You just add up the D&A and the write-offs impairment for that year. But the problem is these write-offs are lumpy. They don't happen every year, okay? So, and also the sales in a particular year, again, could be abnormally high, abnormally low due to my macroeconomic conditions. And the other thing is, we are not modeling a variable cost here. It's a capacity cost. It doesn't change with sales as much as the variable cost changes, right? So a year-specific firm measure doesn't serve the purpose really, even though it's a very easy way to compute it. So what do I do?
Ayan has a question.
Yeah.
So Venkat, when I look at your measure, I was wondering, why don't you also include gains from selling assets? Why do you only include losses? Because gain and losses are kind of symmetric, just the difference between the asset price and your original acquisition price, right? We understand that an impairment is kind of like it's due to the conservative accounting, so it's only one side. But like when you sell assets, you actually have information from both sides.
Yeah.
Why do you include only losses, not gains? What's your
So my intention of including losses is to just measure the cost of it, of losing value, right? The service value. The gains, how do you interpret gains in terms of usage, right? So if I buy an asset
it's
now
not
and
usage,
tomorrow,
is like the discount on your price or some, yeah,
okay.
like your net revenue.
Yeah, and also, and also there's this decision of like, selling an asset at a gain, which could be very firm specific. I wouldn't expect such a phenomenon to happen on an industry level where suddenly the assets of the industry have grown in value and then you can record that as a profit. Right? So here I'm just restricting myself to the cost aspect, and if I record the gains too, then I have to look at the replacement value of assets and the fair value of assets, right?
Mm-hmm.
That should be the methodology I should go for. So every year you measure the fair value of the assets and take the difference, and that should be my cost.
Okay.
Yeah, so for that reason, I've excluded it, but there's no major reason for that of excluding gains.
Venkat, Sudipta has another question for you.
Yes, Sudipta.
So why is goodwill impairment included in Capex?
So when I defined this maintenance Capex in the beginning, I said the expenses related to the long-term operating assets. Ideally, when you talk about this maintenance Capex is more related to the tangible assets. But for some reason, like I wanted to have a kind of a holistic view of all the long-term operating assets because it's very difficult to kind of just focus on the tangible assets and ignore the intangible assets or the goodwill, because everything involves money, right? As a company, I'm putting $1 on at stake, right? And putting those assets on the balance sheet. Now, that dollar has to be allocated to some revenue at some point. So that's why I'm grouping all of them together. So the broad definition is of maintenance Capex is for the entire long-term operating asset bunch.
But I mean, that's going to vary a lot across industry then, right? I mean, whether Capex is the main thing or intangibles is the main thing. So I think then your Capex label is wrong.
Yeah, I'll come to that in my model. I'll highlight that point.
And alternatively, you can just add back the goodwill impairments because CompuStat has that reported separately. So you could just add it back if you wanted to sort of see how much of an effect that has.
Yeah, sure. So I got some mails from the industry as well, saying that, why are you including amortization or goodwill impairment and stuff like that? Because again, they quote Warren Buffett saying that, amortization doesn't matter at all because you have differences in firms, one growing organically, the other growing through acquisitions. So there's a lot of noise there. I can do that. I can easily exclude that and look at it. But I don't know. I started, with the idea that whatever I have on the balance sheet as long-term assets, that cost has to be allocated to the revenue some way. So, and I do acknowledge that firms differ, and I'm going to highlight how that is being taken into consideration in the modeling.
Venkat, Steve has been patiently waiting to ask a question.
Hi, Steve.
Yeah, hi again. How are you? Listen, this write-off of losses on sales of assets, you're taking that as sort of an indication of the obsolescence. But isn't that just a function of the prior depreciation? I mean, the loss is just what you sell it for relative to the book value. So, if it's so it's a prior depreciation which is being used, which is driving that. And then, then you're putting that prior depreciation into your Capex depreciation measure.
Right. If you measure this, everything on a firm-specific basis, you're right. All these issues will crop up, right? But if you look at it on an industry level, right, it's hard to kind of assume that an industry-level loss of sale in assets is because of lower depreciation.
No, I think some industries have more conservative depreciation than others. Okay.
Yeah.
There was a time when computers, they found we weren't depreciation in computers have a short enough life. Okay. We were opposite from conservative.
Yeah. So to that extent, if it is because of slow depreciation, yeah, you could argue that you're catching up. Actually, you're just making up for the low depreciation. It need not be specifically technological obsolescence, but it is still the cost, right? Which has to be allocated. So in this paper, I'm not able to segregate exactly what is the wear and tear cost and what is the technological obsolescence cost. As long as I have both of them included in some form in the total measure, I'm happy with that. Because that goes in, that's an interesting point to kind of estimate like the rate of technological obsolescence for every industry over a period of time. But in this paper, that's not my focus. I'm just including everything into one measure of maintenance Capex.
So Venkat, I'm conscious that you need some time to actually go into your model. So I'm just allowing one more quick follow-up question by Sudipta, and then let's sort of give Venkat some time to go through the slides so that he can explain his model.
Yeah, I was just going to say that FAS 142 forced firms not to amortize goodwill. So if you call that under depreciation, that's not a firm choice. That's a FASB choice. So I think you have to be now very careful in how you describe what you're doing.
Yeah. So it's a fast. Yeah, so it's a FASB choice. But again, so in this paper, I'm not trying to compute the discretion used by an individual manager. I'm looking at that delayed amortization will result in impairment at some point, right? So that's what I'm capturing on an industry basis. Again, I mean, I'll come to that methodology. So in this slide, which is right in front, I'm only talking about the firm-specific measure. Now, in the next slide, I'll explain why I'm moving away from the firm-specific measure, specifically because of all these issues. Okay, so there is manager's discretion involved, in recognizing the impairments, write-offs, and D&A, everything on a firm-specific basis. So I'm not trying to capture that firm-specific discretion. I'm trying to capture at an industry level what is the rate of obsolescence and the cost together. Right. So if you could just compute, so how do you solve this problem of write-off being lumpy and not happening every year? You could just accumulate the capacity cost, which is a sum of D&A and write-offs for over a period of 5 years. And then you could accumulate sales also over a period of 5 years. Now, if you divide one by the other, it could just give you a firm-specific capacity cost for $1 of sale, right? Now, because of the individual discretion exercised by the managers in recognizing these costs, a firm specific measure like that wouldn't help us really, right? So even if you have solved the yearly issue by aggregating these costs, still on a firm specific basis, a manager could take an early write-off, which is not warranted, which we refer to as the big bath phenomenon, right? And you also could choose the useful lives, etc., right? So in order to avoid that, what I do is I regress this cumulative capacity cost and cumulative sales by industry and year, right? So I want to remove this firm-specific idiosyncratic effects and then capture on an industry level what's cost for $1 of sale, right? But even here, we face some issues because in an industry, the firms are so different from each other, right? So they have different cost structures. They have different stages of business life cycle. Their way of growth is different. One might, grow organically. One might go through acquisitions and stuff like that. Now, it's very difficult to capture every single difference, firm-specific character difference. So what I do is I kind of look at 5 broad measures of firm characteristics, which might broadly define the variations among firms in the same industry. And these are operating leverage, degree of operating leverage, firm age, operating lease intensity, goodwill intensity, and SG&A intensity. The idea is really like, if I just sit down and think, okay, how can 2 firms differ from each other broadly? I could say, okay, the way they grew, organic versus acquisitions. Second thing is, okay, 2 firms, same industry, one outsources the manufacturing, the other manufactures in-house, right? So they could have different level of degree of operating leverage. Third thing is firm age. Firms could be at a different stage of business cycle. One could be a growth firm, early stage, where you have new machines, new investments, right? But the sales are lower. Whereas a mature firm would have a mature level of sales, older assets on its balance sheet, etc., right? And also you have this SG&A intensity capturing how do firms differ in terms of their R&D expenditure and SG&A expenditure. Okay, so all these variations could cause a difference in the relationship between the cumulative capacity cost and the cumulative sales, right? So what do? I interact each of these characteristics with the cumulative sales in the regression, which is done by industry and year. So finally, I end up with this model. So I regress cumulative capacity cost and cumulative sales controlled for these firm characteristics, and the sales are also interacted with this firm characteristics. Just to highlight that, okay, based on these firm characteristics, the relationship between capacity cost and sales could change. Okay, so I want that feature into the model, right? So that's what I end up with. And then, using that, I predict the capacity cost. This capacity cost is a cumulative capacity cost for the last 5 years, the recent 5 years, right? And using that, you can divide it by the cumulative sales to get the cost per $1 of sale. And then you multiply it with the current year sales so that you get the annual maintenance Capex. Okay, so at this point, I would like to take a pause and see if there are any questions, Jenny.
Yes, Ayan, just raise her hand.
Yeah.
Hi, Venkat. I think previously Deepak and I have some ideas on kind of like a validation test. And then regarding this slide, I'm just wondering if you can run a few sensitivity tests to your industry aggregate sales for 5 years. So right now you use the Pharma French 48 industry.
Yes.
Have you considered using other more granular, for example,
No,
SIC probably 100 industries, or NAICS probably like 300 or 400 industries, kind of like to get a more finer definition of business models.
Yeah, sure. I could do that. Honestly, I didn't try any other classification because I just went by the recent papers. Like they all use 48 industries, and asset pricing literature also uses this 48 industries. So I stuck with it. Yeah, I could use a more finer classification depending on like the number of observations I get within an industry.
Yeah, so I think a follow-up on that is that once you use a more finer industry kind of groups, you are running into a lack of listed firms in individual industries, right? Yeah. So like if you use NAICS, you can actually use the census data, and then that includes all the privately held firms, and that will give you enough kind of observations for the aggregate industry sales. And then what I'm wondering is that whether the estimate will be very different across different industry membership codes and also incorporating the privately held firms into your industry measure.
Yeah, it could vary. I'm not contesting that. It could definitely vary because these industries, like, you can keep on refining the classification. That's why I said, like, no matter how many controls you have here, you still don't cover the entire differences between two companies, right?
Yeah.
So the idea is to kind of keep it really, fairly simple, as against nailing down the exact cost, right? So that's why I've been very careful in the paper not to claim that this is the best measure or something, but it's definitely better than the D&D is what my point is.
Yeah, but I think the sensitivity test can kind of couple with the validation test to check that in the real world industry or telecom industry, use that as a benchmark to kind of pick which estimate.
Even the number of years used for the accumulation, I just use the 5 years straight away. So you could use 3 would be very short, I would say. So more than 5, but again, you're running into you're taking firms which have 7 years data and stuff. Right. So that will exclude all the new age firms. So the longer you put it, you're comparing the older mature firms like that. So the new cost is not coming into this whole computation at all. The new age firms cost.
Christina, you have a quick point as well on life cycle.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't know how if that could work. I mean, there is this paper on cash flow patterns as indication.
Yeah, so I used that measure too. The only reason why I stuck with age is because that requires cash flow statement information, and which is available post 1988. And my sample period I just used from 1974 till 2016, just to compare this sample with the asset pricing literature sample generally. So I could use that life cycle measure as well. That's a very good life cycle.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And Oliver, you have a quick point.
Yeah, just a quick question about the estimation here. So do you use firm level observations and estimate by industry? Is that correct?
Yeah. So first, firm level, I accumulate I aggregate the capacity costs and sales for the last 5 years, and then I put them in the regression, which is by industry and year. All the controls also are the average values for the last 5 years.
Yeah, I guess then I just have a quick suggestion. So, I mean, if you do it that way, then an observation like General Motors, for example, will get the same weight as a very, very small car producer, right? So maybe, and I guess if you really want to be representative about the industry, they need some form of value weighting going on here, I think.
Yeah, they're all scaled by total assets here, average total assets.
Yeah, but still, I mean, when you just do it like this, then even though it's scaled by total assets, that ratio for GM will get the same weight as the ratio for the very small firm. That's not very representative of the whole productive capacity in the car making industry, right?
Sure.
But what you could do is you could run a weighted regression and weigh it by total assets. That would kind of get at this issue.
Right. Yeah, that's a good suggestion. Thank you.
Go ahead, Venkat.
Okay. How much time do you have? Another 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. So with this model, I'll present the results now. So I look at the sample period of 1974 to 2016. 2016 because I need 2-3 years of future data to kind of look at the effect of this measure on future write-downs, future earnings, and future stock returns. I exclude the financial services industry and then also exclude very small micro firms. So coming to the descriptives, what I found is the MCAP ratio is basically the estimate of maintenance Capex divided by sales. So everything which has a ratio as a suffix is by sales. Okay. So for $1 of sale, you have around 6.7 cents of estimated maintenance Capex on an average, right? So initially I thought, oh, is it so low? But it is. So the recorded D&A expense, which is DP, over $1 of sale is 5.3 cents. Okay, so my estimate is larger than the recorded DP expense. I also look at what will be the value of a firm-specific total cost by sales, which is capacity cost ratio, right? So it's sum of DP and write-downs divided by sales on a firm-specific basis on the aggregate measures. That's around 6.5 cents. Now, what is the effect of the estimate of maintenance capex? That you get to see in the under debt, which is basically maintenance capex, estimated maintenance capex minus the D&A expense. That's under depreciation. It's about 25% more than the recorded depreciation and amortization expense for a median firm. And when it compared to the operating earnings, this is operating earnings after depreciation. The effect of under depreciation is about 7.2% for the median firm, and then on average it's about 11.7%. Now, if you look at the biggest industries where this impact is likely to be higher on under dep over operating income, are the business services. And I mean, if you see these industries, they're either asset intensive or have gone through a lot of technological changes in the recent 2 decades, right? So business services, we have all these the new age technological companies, electronic and communication and computers, they're all asset intensive and also technologically affected industries. So that's where you're going to find a major effect on the operating income. If you just look at the time trend, the maroon line is the DP ratio, which is depreciation amortization over dollar of sale. And the blue line is my estimated maintenance capex ratio. There's a gap between both of them. And so you see that the gap is fairly like, constant over a period of time. At least it's not going up or something. Okay, coming to the validation of my measure, first using the under depreciation, I check whether it can predict future write-offs and hence negative future earnings. We have some papers on write-offs in the past, which showed that these write-offs on a firm-specific basis and on a also industry basis, they tend to be persistent, right? So when you take write-offs in the past, it just doesn't mean that it's one-off and it doesn't have any relationship to the future. They show that there's a persistent, so a firm just taking write-offs, more likely to take write-off in the future. An industry which takes write-offs in the past, more likely to take. So that's kind of a support for my argument saying that you should include these costs in your current estimate of maintenance capex, but because in future also you're going to face a similar cost, right? So I use the under dep to kind of test this validation of future write-offs. And I found that the future write-off, it predicts positive future write-offs. Obviously, when if you can predict future write-offs, then it should predict negative future earnings, right? So that's what this regression is about. So under dep kind of is associated with the negative future earnings. And for returns, if investors do not actually fully price this information, or they miss this in some way, you tend to expect they'll be negatively surprised in the future because you have negative future earnings, and then you have negative returns, right? So I do Pharma Macbeth regressions to show that the under dep industry adjusted under dep has a negative association with future buy and hold annual returns and also the monthly returns. Finally, I look at the long short portfolio returns, going long on firms with higher value of under dep and short on firms with lower value of under dep, and that generates a negative annualized return of around 2.8% for the value weighted returns.
Actually, Sudipta and I have a similar question about M&A. So M&A is known to predict future goodwill write-offs, and also M&A. There's a recent paper that looked at it and saw that if you exclude M&A firms, then the investment anomaly may go away. So how do you treat M&A in this?
So that's a good suggestion. But right now they're all included in it. Maybe I can look at just excluding the M&A firms. But yeah. But if you exclude all the M&A firms, because that's been a kind of a standard practice nowadays, so you might be left with a smaller sample.
It's worth investigating
Sure.
anyway.
Yeah.
And Fabrizio has a question as well.
It was similar in speed. I was wondering, which of the components of your metric mostly explain the under depreciation, and especially the goodwill impairment, which is the one that I felt less. I still feel not so comfortable. I understand your argument, but I still tend to think that during waves of mergers with high prices, there will be a lot of goodwill that comes from overpayment and so on. So I was just wondering, among all those pieces, the write-offs and goodwill impairment, is there a way to give us a sense of which one is the contributing the most to your under depreciation estimate?
It's difficult, but so you're talking about from the components of write-off, goodwill impairment, stuff like that, or you want to segregate the D&A separately and the rest of it separately?
Well, mostly the rest of it, how much the rest of it contributes to the different pieces, like loss on sale of assets, write-offs, goodwill. That was the M&A was kind of hinting also the fact that I think, the good is still something that.
No, I haven't done any tests for that. I haven't segregated these components at all. So yeah, that's a good idea to check.
So we should be giving you a few minutes at the end as well, Venkat, without interruption. I do have a quick suggestion by Oliver. So Oliver, could you please just quickly suggest it, and then maybe we can then let Venkat move on and conclude.
Oh yeah, sure. Venkat, just an idea, given that you collected the data already initially, you could I was just wondering how your estimate of maintenance CapEx compares to firms' actual estimates that they disclosed. So even though you might only have, I'm not sure how many observations you have, and you might suffer from low power there, but just showing kind of some examples there would be kind of nice.
Sure. I think I should do that. I should have done that. I should have compared with Trevor's the anecdotal evidence which I showed from the research reports, right? For the same period around 97, what was my estimate for these companies? I'll do that. So that's how far am I from these estimates or something like that. Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Venkat. So please go ahead. No more interruptions, and you can conclude.
Yeah. So this kind of is a main content. Because the main focus is about under depreciation, but I also look at the underinvestment, the effect of underinvestment for future investment, right? So what is underinvestment? It's my estimate of maintenance capex minus the current investment. Okay, so if you have a higher level of underinvestment, you expect these firms to come to spend more in the future. So investors, if they have this information and they suddenly see a huge investment coming in the future, it'll enable them to kind of not think about it as a entirely growth capex, but also like fulfilling the maintenance needs of the past, right? So my measure of underinvestment also predicts, it's positively associated with the future investments, the total investments as well as the abnormal investments. And finally, so this is like an add-on kind of a thing. So I try to explain the negative relationship between investment and future stock returns using this underinvestment metric. Now, the basic idea is like you're investing in a firm is investing in some assets. Now, if my measure can indicate how much of that was for maintenance, right? If more of that was for maintenance, I want to see this negative relationship being more pronounced for those firms, right? Rather firms with a lower underinvestment value, right? So so that's what I found. The first column is just showing the negative relationship, which has been shown in other papers. And then if I just interact with my measure of maintenance capex, so a firm requiring higher maintenance capex, the negative relationship is more pronounced for such firms compared to the other ones. Okay. So it's similar to kind of if you have a huge R&D expenditure and then you are making a capex on your long-term operating assets, you could kind of understand this as like, okay, most of these assets are going for R&D, right? Similarly, here most of those assets might go for maintenance, right? In which case, the investor shouldn't react that much to such investments. Right? So I think I'm almost done. So to conclude, I propose a measure of maintenance capex for the large sample of firms. And I find that the median firm under depreciates to the extent of 25%, which to its reported D&A expense, resulting in overstatement of operating earnings by 7%. I validate this measure using future write-offs, future earnings, and future stock returns. Thank you so much for the suggestions. And next week, we're going to have Eddie and Federico talk about changes in risk factor disclosures and variance risk premium. So see you everyone on Thursday, October 21st at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Again, thank you very much for your suggestions.
Thank you, Venkat, for the great presentation, and thank you everyone for the questions and suggestions. We ran through it quite quickly, so I know some people are staying behind a little bit, so please feel free to stay behind and stay with Venkat, or if you have to jump off for another meeting, then thanks and see you next week.